Hi everyone, this is Mark, and I'm happy to introduce to you the TokenWork series by Consensus. TokenWork is a consensus crypto economics think tank initiative focused on community development, thought leadership, knowledge sharing, and furthering the discussion about tokenization and crypto economics design. If you are working on an exciting token or crypto economics idea and would like to present it, or if you want to share with us your feedback, comments, and suggestions, please reach out to us at tokenwork@consensus.net. Today's session is our very first TokenWork session. Robby Greenfield from Consensus will be presenting his work about Re-Fungible Assets for social services, tokenizing housing vouchers and food stamps. I hope you enjoy it and stay tuned for the next one.
So you want to go into a quick introduction as to, why I even, create token models for the social sector and kind of what the thought process is, kind of where the beginnings of this one went, and, kind of the background and the outline of how I do these decks for anyone who's, interested in doing their own. And then, just getting into a breakdown of, the different problems with the housing market. This will be within a kind of an American-focused lens, but it's certainly scalable across different public sector, frameworks in a lot of different countries outside of the United States as well, and kind of shows some middle ground between non-fungible tokens and fungible tokens in terms of how do we make markets more liquid when value is unique, kind of the main premise. And then oftentimes, I'll have like model benefits to end, and a few user experience callouts as well, that I'm starting to realize in a lot of these different models. So to get into it, for those who are kind of unaware with the housing choice voucher program in the United States, many years ago and around the 1970s, 1960s, you had, the beginnings of kind of Section 80 housing. And this was essentially, or actually it was initially housing for middle class white families coming out of different war efforts. And it didn't have the stigma of that it does today in terms of being, kind of essentially kind of ghettos, unfortunately. It was kind of made, to give, resources to those that in the middle class that, wanted to have some type of affordable living while they, found kind of transitional work outside of, fighting war. And over time, when you saw like the middle class of the United States expand, you saw these people get a lot of grants from things like the GI Bill, and they really started to create a basis for wealth. And the United States has kind of led to most people considering themselves middle class in the United States. Of course, a lot of people of color, people with different varying sexual orientations, were not offered these same grants, and you started to see wide stratification in terms of the haves and have-nots when it came to housing, particularly. So we saw transition of middle class families living in these areas to or housing projects to people of color, and now a lot of those areas are seen as some of the worst places to live in. So not too long ago, they decided we really shouldn't build these places just for them to become really poorly maintained by the state, and just not the best places to live, and extremely limiting in terms of, and volatile for like kids to grow up in, because they're never really in good school districts. And it kind of shows you the effects of what happens when you don't live in a good area. Like, you don't have access to a good education. You do have access to bad influences that increase your propensity to go to jail. So they created housing choice voucher. So instead of creating or constructing, the project, you gave someone the ability to move wherever they kind of wanted. And the way that it works is pretty simple, and we'll kind of get into the statistics in a second. But essentially, and we can show this right here. Essentially, you have a total rent amount, and your voucher pays for part of that, to like a certain extent, and that allows you to kind of live places that you would otherwise not be able to live. You see this in San Francisco and Oakland in the Bay Area and many places across the United States. But there's a few huge issues with this. One, say we all, get housing vouchers because we fit the bill in Oakland, and we want to live in San Francisco, which are very close to each other. You get your voucher based off a few things, mostly what your rent is and how much you get paid. It can also be, on the equation of like your dependencies and your dependents rather, and a few other kind of socioeconomic factors. And also, it's based on where you're living. So Oakland is less expensive to live in than San Francisco. So right now, what they do is they will do like an equal exchange. You get a housing voucher in Oakland, they'll exchange it 1-to-1 to San Francisco, even though the cost of living in those two places is completely different. And that takes away one housing voucher for someone who could have gotten one in San Francisco. And you know that those two things aren't equal. So we're starting to exchange these non-fungible assets, right? Because it's the value specific to the person receiving it that have fungible qualities, right? Because there's money associated with literal money that's associated with this. So that's kind of the basis, the premise of the problem is, how can we make these type of markets more liquid, and how can we really start to nationalize access so that you can get a voucher anywhere in the United States or any country that you're implementing the system, and you can find the equivalent value anywhere else that you would want to live, instead of being kind of bound to areas that typically are in the same neighborhood as the housing project that was created 40 or 50 years ago, ironically. So another issue is that growing population, a lot of people, need this, but, a lot of people can't access it. And funding is completely inadequate. So we need probably over $1 billion more than what we have. The waiting lists for these type of things are in a matter of years. It's just an increasingly bad problem in terms of how much social sector problems like this can help. So this kind of gives just a little bit. I'm not going to really kind of read the slides per se, but again, social sector systems like these, the one main kind of consistent property is that there are equations for this based off of income. So there are different parameters that are a little bit different than your normal non-fungibles, right? That are more speculative in value. The biggest part again is this. So determining how much that assistance amount is, how much that non-fungible asset represents, based off your monthly income and your total rent. So an example, if your monthly income is $1,850 a month, and you would pay $555 toward the rent, right? So only 30%. And if the total rent for the apartment is $850, the assistance would pay for $295, and so forth. So going into the benefits of a housing voucher market. So the program does benefit. It does fight homelessness, strengthens families, strengthens communities, and expands opportunities, and for children in general. So, when we talk about and social impact, how do we get rid of homelessness? How do we get rid of some of these other kind of tertiary features of blight when it comes to our communities? A lot of that is based in housing, and it's unfortunate when people try to attend to an education problem or attend to a crime problem, and they don't realize that a lot of these problems are interconnected. Right? If you're homeless or you don't have enough money to afford a place to live, you're going to get exposed to a lot of different things that are going to affect your attention in school, which is going to affect your opportunity later down the line. So none of these issues are completely independent. Again, problems. 7 out of 10 low-income American households pay too much for rent. So just the cost of living in general is getting incredibly ridiculous. Bay Area is a perfect example. I would say that the average rent, in San Francisco is probably around high $2,000s to $3,000 a month. In Oakland, East Bay, probably all the way down to San Jose, it's probably about $2,000 a month. This is like for a 1-bedroom or studio. So certainly way too much for a family. And not all families who receive vouchers are able to find a house or apartment where they can use them. So they end up having to not go to the places that, this whole freedom of choice system kind of wanted them to be, in terms of having access to good schools and stuff like that. And then, of course, transferring vouchers, again, like I said, it's a bureaucratic nightmare, and this is why a lot of districts just do to one-to-one. But there is an official process that is a lot of paperwork, and a lot of districts just don't like using it that way. So they have this kind of informal exchange. So why tokenize this? I'm sure, especially now coming out of the hype, a lot of people want to tokenize a lot of different things that may not necessarily need it. But I think strategically, tokenization can affect a lot of change and some of these systems. And I think it's not just housing vouchers that has this model. It's also food stamps, or what's called now in the United States, the Supplemental Nutritional Assessment or Assistance Program. Reason is because that is also a partial non-fungible, right? Something that, the value that each person is assigned or given access to is unique to that person. It's not just spread across equally. The traditional housing market has a great amount of potential if it can overcome its funding and cross-locality illiquidity issues. Overall user experience within the current system needs improvement. Landlords need to be convinced to take this, because a lot of landlords don't want to, have tenants that are reliant on this type of thing, which again causes discrimination issues. Digitizing the disbursement of this value and the exchange of this value could realize some exponential, potential, service benefits. Kind of getting into it, how would this happen? You could represent it as non-fungibles, but the issue is that you do still want to have like a real life value based off of it. So then we start to get into like tokenized vouchers as a unit of account, or you could have tokenized vouchers as re-fungible assets. So these are the two kind of directions that I found were probably the most crypto economically stable. What's in a unit of account? So this would be pretty much just a representation, right? So very much serving as an IOUs and a method of accounting, so that you could do a lot of the transactions when it comes to exchange and disbursement, but they really kind of only represent digital IOUs. This kind of making the whole process a little bit more digital than it is. You can add, some, exchanges of fiat, for ownership of, these tokens, more simply put. Reason why you would want like this, kind of a unit of account is for exactly that, accounting. And it's keeping track of owed payments, between landlords, between the government, right, the locality, so the housing kind of authority, and the tenant themselves. Some benefits to this. Recipient applies, the process. Recipient applies to receive housing assistance. Local housing authority vets applicant and approves their application. Local housing authority sends participant program onboarding information, and such. Recipient makes an account. Each account has an embedded wallet to receive and send housing voucher tokens, but to the recipient, much of this is abstracted to be more or less voucher credits, right? So this is another thing that I talk a little bit later about is user experience. Like, they don't need to know that these are tokens. That's kind of just the immutable reference of the different transactions that's going on within the housing kind of market. All landlords who want to accept housing vouchers recipients into their complexes can simply create an account, set up a type of wallet, and get those tokens, and that kind of shows proof of receipt, right? Recipient simply sends a token, per month, or however many, if you want to make it equivalent to the cost of $1, or the cost of how much is being paid. And landlord redeems direct deposit wire transfer to their bank account for each token they send back to the housing authority. So kind of cyclical, almost vanity token. This wouldn't actually need to be an ER 721. This could be a vanity ERC 20. Something that's a little bit more active are Re-Fungible Assets. So for those who aren't familiar, Re-Fungible Assets are assets that can go from non-fungible, right, so unique status, back to something fungible, so like a dollar. Example of non-fungible, for those who are kind of unfamiliar with this terminology, something non-fungible, something is unique, is kind of like artwork. That it can be worth a lot of different values, depending on the person that's transacting. Something that's fungible, right, is $1. $1 is going to be worth $1. You could have somebody pay $10 for $1, but that's not it doesn't happen too often. So Re-Fungible is when you have a non-fungible asset that can be linked to a fungible value. And because we had that great equation up there, we know that we can do this with these type of services and food allocations really easily, because it's already how those systems work. So a token representing a redeemable assistance amount of housing based on the housing authority that governs the locality, the income of the housing voucher applicant, and the rent of the housing applicant. So now we're starting to set some pretty dynamic parameters that can respond based on the district that you're in. And that's something that can be dictated by either a smart token ratio that's specific to that locality using Bancor, or a protocol that governs kind of how these Re-Fungible assets are maintained and transacted. And also a big difference between this one and the unit of account, right? The unit of account doesn't really have any value, so it's safe in that way. It's harder to commit fraud because you're going to know, which accounts are whitelisted in terms of program recipients, and the same thing for landlords, right? That's all kept on record. This token, has monetary consideration. It's connected by a stable store value. So in this model, it's DAI, or the stablecoin created by MakerDAO. That's going to be multi-collateral. And more technically, the token resembles an ERC 721 token, but it's more readily exchangeable with other ERC 721 voucher tokens, given that it can be automatically calculated based on the voucher holder's rent, salary, and controlling housing authority. So again, it's like an ERC 721, but it has a much more calculated value, or kind of access to what that value may be. This would be kind of like, example of how this could look. Housing voucher token price could be 1 month of assistance, which would mean that, housing voucher token price is the total rent minus the tenant salary times 30%. These things can be done by a bank or a smart token so that you have that immediate liquidity. Thing is that like bank or smart tokens are ERC 20s. They're not ERC 721s, and this would need to be an ERC 721 connected to an ERC 20. So there's a bit of novelty in that, in terms of what exists out there. And there's some governing aspects as well in terms of partially non-fungible assets or refungible assets in terms of connectors. So we won't get too much into this. This is a little bit more of the technical side of things in terms of how this could work. But more importantly, and kind of one of my last statements before I get into liquidity and some peer-to-peer funding models, because I do want to have time for questions, is potential recipient applies just like before. Local housing authority vets just like before. Sends them onboarding information. They create an account, and they get these credits. But now when, landlords who want to accept housing voucher recipients into their complexes, when they're getting, this money, they don't really need to wait for wire transferred funds. So it kind of increases or decreases the lead time for landlords to get their money, because now they have something that's easily exchangeable, right? For DAI or for fiat, right? And that could be via DApp pretty simply. They give that to, an address or some type of portal that's maintained by the housing authority, and they immediately get the money that they need. And that's what we see in the last part there. Excuse me. Again, biggest part of this is increased liquidity between localities. So now you're going from, excuse me, this kind of antiquated system of equivalence, living in districts that, like are obviously not worth the same amount when living there. And basically their current, like the traditional options are, you can transfer the family to the new housing authority, which must agree to absorb the transfer by issuing one of its own vouchers. So that's that 1-to-1. Or you can pay, the housing authority can pay the receiving housing authority for performing administrative functions such as income certifications, housing inspections, and lease renewals. And no one wants to do the latter, right? Even if you were unaware or unfamiliar with the space, that just doesn't sound like a good option. So, as we can see, the traditional system is exchanging non-fungible assets, vouchers, between jurisdictions at the expense of the value of each of the vouchers and the accounting of the housing authorities. That's another thing, is a lot of fraud happens, both in the food stamp market and the housing voucher market, because you have all of these, equal exchanges where things aren't equal, and a lot of the accounting isn't best kept. So there's a lot of opportunity for fraud because the accounting is all messed up. So when you tokenize vouchers, another thing that you get is you can now fractionally exchange value where you couldn't before. So this would be akin to exchanging like $1 for 0.81 euro, right? We're not exchanging $1 for 1 euro. This saves, the housing authorities a great deal of money on every exchange, both in voucher value and in operational expenses, in terms of just the time that it takes to do these things. So accounting for cross-jurisdictional voucher exchanges is automatically recorded on chain, no matter how many exchanges are on the network, making a perfectly accountable system. So you should always know where the money, coming from housing authority to landlord back to housing authority is. And lastly, this introduces some really interesting, and this is where we get into some pretty speculative kind of new economy features of, how does this affect what's going on, is peer-to-peer housing assistance. So again, before we saw that we do not have enough money to support programs like this, at least in the United States. We're off by $1 billion, and that kind of swings to the whims of, what's politically convenient. And with an increased population, this is sure to get worse, and essentially it just extends that wait list, from 2 years to 3 years to 5 years, when people need housing now, particularly when they're children. So you can realize new funding models depending on how you tie your ecosystem to liquidity. So, since these tokens are being backed by fungible assets like stablecoins or tokenized fiat, philanthropists could donate directly to housing assistance liquidity reserves that back houser tokens. So you're saying, like, how would this work, right? Would it be an escrow or anything like that? No, you could use Bancor's smart token model. So again, this would be non-fungible asset connected to something like DAI, in which how that works is you can only mint any of that non-fungible asset, whether fractionally, you can get, a decimal of it, or in whole units, if, the ratio of funds, right, is committed to the smart contract. So, if we deem, one, non-fungible or housing, token to be, $10, with inflation of like, I don't know, 1% over a year. In order for that to be minted, there needs to be 10 DAI tokens submitted to that contract. And this is interesting because it allows different entities to fund the minting of housing vouchers in a way that we haven't seen before. And, as more liquidity is pumped into the system has a greater ability to support the disbursement of more housing vouchers. So philanthropist contributions can be directly traced to the person that they've helped, and these donors can be rewarded via tax credits for their charity pretty immediately, given that, there's not much variability in the prices. And, I won't go into this too much, but it kind of shows, what that might look like. So another interesting thing is airdropping tokenized vouchers to waitlisted program recipients. So, right now you kind of have to go in and get your housing voucher, and you have to kind of stay up to date as to where you are on the wait list. So airdropping assistance can be automated for pre-approved waitlist recipients for funding new housing voucher tokens and saving the operational expense of, fighting recipient waitlist backlog. So it kind of automatically fights against the backlog when you can airdrop to those people in need. And then lastly was kind of user experience. To users, they really should know that these are tokens. They really should know that blockchain is being used. It should be all abstracted. It should just work. And I think this is just a general tenet for blockchain dApps or operational models. And then last, kind of operational benefits, again, just automated accounting of housing voucher transactions across the network, increased liquidity between jurisdictions when housing voucher recipients want to use their voucher in a different jurisdiction. So automated conversion between partially non-fungible assets, so saved operational costs, saved vouchers from being overspent to absorb, and then introduces new funding models for peer-to-peer housing assistance and just simpler UX for voucher recipients and landlords, which most likely would be a phone or some web app, but certainly simpler than what they're doing now. Woo! Okay, guys, I know that was a lot. I appreciate your patience, and for the rest of the time, we can kind of just talk through this, but wanted to kind of get through the background and stuff like that. So I apologize if that was like entirely boring.
That was awesome, Robby. Thanks for presenting. So we didn't have any questions submitted online, so I guess we can go directly to an open floor for any questions or comments.
Yeah.
Robbie, as an intermediate step, could you just do the bank transfer option for people as well, without having the whole DAI aspect of it, or is that pretty crucial to keeping it as a unit of account?
Yeah. So for the unit of account, it would just be bank transfer, and that would, like as is defined, just be a unit that, an IOU, right? Like we owe you this money. But I certainly think that, again, just knowing where these resources are going and how they can be exchanged and how that's associated with the voucher itself is something that's extremely important and like really, really outdated. So yeah, it certainly doesn't need to be a refungible asset. I do think, though, in the future as we become more cashless, and then you also have to think of, what's keeping landlords in good areas accepting candidates like these. And one of the biggest incentives that I could find is them getting their money as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, because that's where you see a lot of discrimination, and that's again where you start to see stratification. It's just the fact that in the United States, if you're white and you're living off of housing vouchers, you will probably find better neighborhoods to live in because landlords will be more comfortable with you living there. But if you're, Latino, Hispanic, or Black, odds are that you're not. The probability is just not there. So there has to be some type of incentive when adopting a system like this, in which people know that they're going to get paid, unfortunately.
Robbie, this is a question submitted online. So the question is, are token vouchers transferable?
Yes. So let me, I guess, meet that question. Transferable between those who are whitelisted in a program like this. So this certainly would need, a whitelist, for recipients. It does get into a recurring and increasingly recurring theme in social impact, in which a lot of NGOs are starting to look at cash transfers instead of like giving non-fungible resources like food and vouchers to stores and things like this. The reason being is that however much the government thinks it knows what people want, people know what they want. So providing that liquidity so that they can get other things, if it's not housing that they want to focus on, is certainly the system could be open to that. And I think that's another reason why it's important to kind of understand the inflow and outflow of things like the tokenized vouchers, which really can only be used for housing, and liquidity to something that's a little bit more general, to like normal money.
Yeah, Robbie, I submitted the question. The challenge is then the in terms of choice, making the right choice with regard to allocation of funds. Are those funds being used wisely or not, versus when you're giving an assistance? That's one question. The other, if it's transferable, then you're open to economic extortion attacks, right?
No, absolutely. And this is a broader issue that universal basic income faces as well. And at this point, at least on the traditional side with these type of systems, right? Just like kind of how the current standard works. There's not much to be known about how people will transact. Certainly exploits will be attempted. I mean, that's a given. And even right now in the Bay Area, they're actually doing a universal basic income test in which they just provide people with just general cash instead of vouchers like these, just to see how they would spend them, how things would go. They had one in Finland about a year or so ago, and no conclusive results were kind of received from that. So it's interesting because that type of space, when you start to generalize, social service support, it's almost more infantile than the blockchain ecosystem. But no, I mean, you're absolutely right.
Robby, if you want to, there's some research, actually quite extensive research about end player public goods games, and if you're interested in that, I'm happy to share that. And it's really a question of the distribution of shirkers versus altruistic participants. And then it becomes a question of can you create something like altruistic self-policing, and that is highly dependent on residual clemency, and so that a lot of work has gone already into looking into that. And I think often these experiments that are doing that are actually not aware of this type of research in behavioral psychology. Otherwise, they wouldn't have structured the Finland experiments the way they did.
Yeah, no, I would if you could Slack it to me or email it to me, I would greatly appreciate it. But yeah, no, I certainly, again, systems like these need a happy medium between the crypto economic and game theory thinking, and a good understanding of traditional economy parameters that should set value or equate value. And it's interesting because solutions like these, they're less kind of DApp development, in terms of front end and everything like that, and certainly more crypto economically focused in terms of how do we just get this right for one locality. But once you get it right or get it okay, the money that it saves is insane. Yeah.
Hey, Robby, another question. Is anything being done to partner with existing organizations to track current funding and spend for housing?
Yeah. So in the Bay Area, we have a partner called RTI International that does a lot of government research and has a really good pulse of just, how feasible it is to work with government partners on things like this, which, if you're interested, it's not very feasible, at least not without a use case. So we found another partner, the Housing Trust of Silicon Valley, which is based in South Bay, so San Jose area. And they're actually kind of a very rare privatized example of housing vouchers. So they have their own properties. They're an organization that has their own properties, and they do their own housing voucher system to their own properties. So it's a really nice medium to try these type of things out. So we're beginning discussions with them just to get a use case and the research around it, right? And really walking through this as empirically as possible. And of course, guys, if any of you all, I see a lot of really, really smart people on this call. if any of you all want to take this and run with it, feel free. That's and again, one of the things that I found is super helpful is merging those kind of crypto economic theories that we all kind of come across and reading kind of research reports on these different type of social services to kind of iterate on what these models look like. Yeah.
So here's another question. So where do you see this being rolled out first and when? And also, is it built for a global model or just the USA?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In terms of where it can be used, this is one of the few token models that I do see it could use case like a sandbox use case could feasibly be done in the United States. I do think that areas like New York and New York City and the Bay Area are great targets, just because that's where housing, issues are the highest, right? Because it's very expensive to live. I think using it in emerging economies with different systems, those economic parameters are going to have to change. So I think this is one of those type of systems where it's the development of maybe a generic smart contract protocol and the refundable asset itself that can be changed many different times in many different areas. It's not going to be a global exchange, or at least I don't think, just because there's just too many different parameters that different countries have kind of set precedents in terms of like social service support, and that's a political thing rather than it is an economic thing, but it becomes a political thing. Yeah.
I have a question. Social services like, Medicaid and stuff like that already have a lot of computer-based problems. Like they'll change your insurance, or they'll change your whole program and send you like a letter, and they won't even robocall you. And it causes a lot of issues. And I've known people that said, for instance, that their child got taken off Medicaid by accident. And when they went in the office, they couldn't determine whether it got reactivated on the computer in front of them. So why do you think adding more technology is going to make, not that I don't think this is awesome, but why do you think adding more technology is going to make things better? And if so, like how are you going to address these kind of issues with technology in the government sector already?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Certainly, you don't want to create a solution looking for a problem. I think one of the initial things in terms of like how could this make it better is just looking for the niche problems first. I mean, I'm just like to your point. In some cases, I feel like the public sector just needs a website, that just functions correctly, and it doesn't have to be like a blockchain thing. But in this particular circumstance, I think one of my greatest worries was the problem of exchange. The fact that people want to move all the time, and to your point, people's kind of livelihoods change a lot, but there's this kind of a practice of equivalency and fraud that happens when one person with a voucher wants to live somewhere else. I mean, that the expenditure on that is ridiculous. And I think when you talk about like political scale, political scale being you have states in the U.S. like California that house a lot of sanctuary cities in which you're now not only dealing with your citizenry, but you're also dealing with undocumented residents that want the same access to the potential and opportunity that they certainly deserve. It's very difficult economically to support that many people if you have any type of kind of leakages in the system, right, in terms of inefficiency. And that was the main niche that I wanted to attend to is how can we make this equivalency exchange more efficient? But it certainly is gonna, have to be paired with just a better user experience overall. And that's something that a lot of, I would say probably almost every social service in the United States just completely lacks.
Yeah.
So Robby, actually, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt. I actually had a thought around where actually to start. where there's and it's actually I would focus on cities like Boise, Idaho, because you have two things that are coming together. You have a high crunch real estate market around rents on the one hand, and you have Republicans control everything, and you go to them and say you can cut 20% of your cost this way, they'll say yes.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Right, because just align desired outcomes. Right, they want to cut back their government spending. Do it. It's like, fine. Here's a way how you can save 20%, make it more efficient, get the landlords their money faster, and allow the city. Then you can say, hey, you can turn this around and give the city more allowances to split it half. Give the city more allowances to expand their affordable housing, because people are getting crowded out, and or you extend it to have people move to neighboring jurisdictions where it's cheaper, and then again you save money because you're saving operational costs. So you can actually I think you will actually have an easier time to implement something like that in a Republican control state and municipality than in a place like California, to be honest. It sounds counterintuitive, but the saving money and being able to cut budget plays well.
Yeah, no, I'll certainly look down that road. And I agree. It's kind of one of the drawbacks to localities that are kind of seen as, and I put seen in italics, as progressive, is that in practice they might not be as open to things like this. So yeah, I absolutely look at that. Boise.
I'm sure they're. Yeah, Boise, Idaho, or others like Phoenix area. But so the point is, it's just the scale is less, right? The scale is less. Their incentive to cut costs, right? Whereas if you have a progressive, you say, hey, let's cut costs, right, and not expand it, then you have the discussion, why not give more money to people, blah blah blah. It's like, it's not about giving more money to people. It's about making this stuff easier, and then in the next step you can say, well, can we avoid cutting, increasing the percentage to 35%, what HUD wants to do.
Yeah,
right.
But
So
I have a question. Do we even know what the projected costs would be to make like a actual production level, even in a small municipality, for this kind of thing? Having it implemented saves money, but what about creating it and deploying it? From where it actually is.
Yeah, so there are a few ways that you could create something like this without incurring any transactional expenses when it comes to like the network, right? So the easiest is creating a parity chain which has a higher throughput. Of course, if you're dealing with like a locality, and when I say locality, like town within a town, not the whole city. Because that's where these things need to kind of be proven. Then it should be relatively manageable and scalable, right? Because these type of payments aren't done like 10 or 20 times a month, right? They're done pretty much once a month. Of course, you'll have transactions in terms of registrations and things like that. If you don't give them to the earlier prompts a way to cash out and use that aid in a different way than created, it's actually a relatively manageable system in terms of the throughput needed. So pretty.
Yeah, the turnover is not high.
Yeah. But of course, the one thing that would need
Not
to be
to cut off this conversation. We're running out of time, and it seems like this has gone on for a long time. It's a great topic, and maybe this would be better taken in another call. I would like to open the floor or just do a last call for any other questions for anyone on the call.
Yeah. And again, guys.
Okay, sounds good. Robby, thanks so much for presenting. Thank you everyone once again for joining the demo session. This happens bi-weekly. If you're interested in presenting a crypto economic idea like what you just saw or token model, please ping me or Mark Ziade. And also TokenWork is also hiring a junior crypto economic analyst. So if you may know a good candidate, please also message us for that. All right, thanks everyone.
Yeah. We'll see y'all later.